Imagine a city where the mayor's office, a symbol of public trust and order, was not just influenced by the Mafia, but was, for all practical purposes, a fully operational Mafia headquarters. A place where the pen used to sign official documents was dipped not in ink, but in the blood of countless victims, where building permits were not about urban planning, but about a criminal empire's blueprint for total domination. This is not the plot of a grim television drama. This was the shocking reality of Palermo, Italy, for decades. And at the very heart of this grotesque fusion of government and organized crime stood one man, a politician so brazen, so deeply entwined with the Cosa Nostra, that his name became synonymous with corruption itself, Vito Ciancimino. Before we delve into this dark and intricate tale, I must offer a crucial disclaimer. The story you are about to hear is a synthesis of information gathered from a multitude of sources: court transcripts, judicial sentences, historical archives, biographies, and investigative journalism. The purpose of presenting this narrative is solely to bring a well-researched and accurate account of these historical events to you, the viewer. Our aim is to inform and educate, piecing together the complex puzzle of a man who helped orchestrate one of the most audacious criminal takeovers of a modern European city. To understand the monumental scale of Vito Ciancimino's betrayal, we must first journey back to his origins, to the dusty, sun-baked streets of a small town in Sicily, where the seeds of a future that would paralyze an entire region with fear and corruption were first sown. It was in the town of Raff, Duty, in the province of Agrigento, that Vito Ciancimino was born on April 25, 1924. His family was not wealthy, and the Sicily of his youth was a place of profound contrasts, of stunning natural beauty and deep, festering social wounds. It was a world still reeling from the impacts of war, a world where the central government in far-off Rome often felt like a distant, uncaring entity, and where local power structures held the real keys to survival and prosperity. For many young men of his generation, the path to a better life was fraught with limited options. The Ciancimino family, like many others, looked for opportunity wherever it could be found, and they eventually moved to the much larger and more dynamic city of Palermo. This move from the rural periphery to the urban heart of Sicily would prove to be the most decisive turning point in young Vito's life. Palermo in the 1930s and 1940s was a chaotic, vibrant, and often brutal metropolis. It was a city being rebuilt, both physically and socially, from the devastation of the Second World War. And in the shadows of its bombed out buildings and within the intricate web of its ancient alleyways, the Sicilian Mafia, the Cosa Nostra, was not just surviving, it was methodically consolidating its power, infiltrating every facet of economic and social life. It was in this environment that Vito Ciancimino began to carve out his own path. He was a young man with ambition, a sharp mind, and an understanding of the pragmatic realities of his world. He initially trained as a barber, a trade that placed him at the center of community gossip and networks. But his ambitions lay elsewhere. He possessed a natural political acumen and a charisma that drew people to him. He became involved in the local political scene, which in post-war Sicily was a turbulent and dangerous arena. His first significant political affiliation was with the monarchist party, but his true alignment was always more pragmatic than ideological. He understood that power in Sicily did not necessarily flow from political parties, but from the clandestine, parallel government of the Mafia clans. It was during this formative period that Ciancimino began to forge the relationships that would define his life and his legacy. He did not start as a high-level boss. Rather, he positioned himself as a useful intermediary, a fixer, a man who could get things done in the nebulous space where official bureaucracy met the underworld. He cultivated connections with rising mafia figures in the Palermo neighborhoods, men who were part of the new, more aggressive generation of Cosa Nostra that was moving beyond traditional rural crime into the lucrative fields of urban public contracts and market control. His ability to navigate both worlds, the legitimate political sphere and the illicit criminal one, made him an invaluable asset. He was building a bridge, and in time, he would not just be the man who crossed it. He would be the man who controlled the tolls on both sides. This was the slow, meticulous rise of Vito Ciancimino, a rise that was happening away from the public spotlight. In the smoke-filled back rooms of political clubs and in the whispered conversations on street corners, a quiet, patient ascent that was setting the stage for a storm that would forever change the face of Palermo. The political landscape of Italy in the post-war era was a fertile ground for the seeds Ciancimino was so carefully planting. As the Cold War intensified, the Christian Democracy Party, or Democrazia Cristiana, emerged as the dominant political force, a bulwark against the rising popularity of the Communist Party. In Sicily, the Christian Democrats needed local power brokers, men who could deliver votes and ensure stability, or at least a controllable form of chaos. Vito Ciancimino, with his growing web of connections in both the legitimate political wards and the illicit underworld, was the perfect candidate. He formally joined the Christian Democrats and began his rapid ascent through its local ranks in Palermo. His political career was not built on grand speeches or ideological fervor. It was built on a much more tangible currency: favors, loyalty, and fear. He became known as Ingegner, the engineer, though he had no formal engineering degree, a title that spoke volumes about his role as a facilitator, a builder of systems, both concrete and corrupt. His power base was the working class neighborhood of the Calza, a historic district where he cultivated a persona of a man of the people, someone who could solve problems when the slow, indifferent state machinery could not. He would help a family get a pension, find a job for a young man, expedite a permit. These small acts of patronage were the bricks with which he built his political fortress. And the mortar that held it all together was the silent, unspoken understanding that his benevolence was backed by a fearsome power. This was the genius of Ciancimino's strategy. He made himself indispensable. To the poor and disenfranchised, he was a benefactor. To the Christian Democrat Party bosses, he was a vote getter who could guarantee electoral victories. And to the Mafia, he was their man on the inside, their long-term investment in the heart of the state. His election to the Palermo City Council in 1956 was a watershed moment, marking the official beginning of the Cosa Nostra's direct and unfettered access to the levers of municipal power. From his council seat, and later as the assessor for public works, Ciancimino was perfectly positioned to orchestrate what would become the most brilliant and transformative criminal enterprise in modern Italian history, the sack of Palermo. This was not a single event, but a prolonged, systematic looting of the city, a frenzy of construction and destruction that would make a handful of Mafia associated builders astronomically wealthy, while utterly defacing the ancient and beautiful city. The mechanism was deceptively simple. A 1959 master plan for Palermo had been approved, intended to guide the city's expansion and modernization. In the hands of Ciancimino and his associates, this plan became a criminal weapon. He wielded his power over building permits and zoning laws like a scythe. Historic villas with their lush gardens, known as green pearls, were mysteriously rezoned for high-density residential development. The permits to demolish these architectural treasures and build new, often shoddily constructed apartment blocks, would be granted almost exclusively to a tight, knit circle of builders who were either Mafia members themselves or paid a hefty pizzo or kickback to the clan. The process was ruthlessly efficient. A builder would approach the relevant Mafia family, who would then ensure that Ciancimino's office issued the necessary permit with impossible speed, bypassing all normal bureaucratic and legal hurdles. In return, the Mafia received a large percentage of the contract value, and Ciancimino consolidated his political and financial power. The city was consumed by a concrete cancer. Wide, tree-lined avenues were choked with traffic, and neighborhoods lost their character and soul, transformed into dense, impersonal jungles of reinforced concrete. This was not urban development. It was a parasitic extraction of wealth, a transfer of public resources into private, criminal hands on an unprecedented scale. The sack of Palermo created a new class of Mafia millionaires, the Corleonesi and other ruthless clans, who used this colossal influx of cash to finance their expansion into more violent and international criminal ventures, including the burgeoning heroin trade. Ciancimino was the central cog in this machine, the official stamp of legitimacy on a grand theft of a city's heritage and future. He became wealthy and powerful, his influence stretching from the darkest back alleys to the brightest halls of regional government, a testament to the terrifying success of his lifelong project to merge the Mafia with the state. The pinnacle of Vito Ciancimino's political and criminal ascent was reached on July 25, 1970, when he was elected mayor of Palermo. It was a moment of supreme, almost surreal irony. The man who was a key architect of the city's systematic looting was now its highest ranking official, the symbolic father of the very community he was helping to destroy. His tenure as mayor was brief, lasting only until the following year, but it was profoundly significant. It represented the ultimate triumph of the Cosa Nostra's long-term infiltration strategy, the town hall was now, for all intents and purposes, a Mafia subsidiary. During his time in the mayor's office, the sack of Palermo did not pause. It accelerated, operating with a brazenness that suggested a feeling of utter impunity. The flow of building permits to Mafia-friendly contractors became a torrent, and the city's transformation into a concrete jungle continued unabated. Ciancimino's administration was a caricature of public service, a blatant front for the wholesale redistribution of public wealth into criminal coffers. However, the very audacity of this operation began to sow the seeds of its own eventual destruction, while the general public, cowed by fear and a long-standing culture of silence known as omertu, largely looked the other way. There were those who refused to remain quiet. A small but courageous group of journalists, magistrates, and political activists began to connect the dots, their suspicions growing with every historic villa that was demolished and every new, anonymous apartment block that sprang up in its place. Figures like the journalist Giuseppe Impastato, who bravely used his radio show to mock and denounce the Mafia and their political protectors by name, including Ciancimino, began to create cracks in the wall of silence. The political climate was also shifting. While Ciancimino remained a powerful force within the Christian Democrat Party apparatus, his notoriety was becoming a liability for the National Party, which was keen to project an image of clean governance in Rome, even as it tolerated local alliances with criminal elements in the South. His overt connections were too glaring to ignore forever. The first major legal tremor came in the early 1980s, not from a building permit scandal, but from the investigation into the infamous murder of General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, the anti-mafia crusader who was assassinated with his wife in Palermo in 1982. The outrage following this brutal killing galvanized the state's response, leading to the appointment of magistrates like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. These prosecutors adopted revolutionary investigative methods, focusing on the financial trails and the political connections of the Mafia, rather than just their violent crimes. They began to peel back the layers of the Cosa Nostra's structure, and their inquiries inevitably led them to the door of the former mayor. Ciancimino's fall from grace was not immediate. It was a slow, grinding process of legal entanglements that mirrored his own patient rise. He was arrested for the first time in 1984, a seismic event that sent shockwaves through Italian society. Here was a former mayor, a man who had held one of the most respected public offices, being led away in handcuffs, accused of being a fully fledged member of the Mafia. The evidence that began to emerge was staggering. It painted a picture of a man who was not merely an accomplice or a corrupt politician taking bribes, but a man of honor himself, a formal member of the Cosa Nostra's San Lorenzo Pallavicino family. The legal proceedings revealed the intricate web of his dealings, detailing how he had used his political power to direct public works contracts to Mafia-backed firms, how he had manipulated urban planning laws to benefit specific clans, and how he had amassed a vast personal fortune. that was completely disproportionate to his official income. The trial was a spectacle, a national reckoning with a truth that many had suspected, but few had been able to prove, that the Mafia and the state had become inextricably intertwined, and Vito Ciancimino was the living, breathing embodiment of that terrifying fusion. He was initially convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a verdict that felt like a victory for justice. But the story was far from over, as the man who knew all the secrets was now behind bars, and his knowledge was a commodity more valuable than any of the illicit riches he had accumulated. The imprisonment of Vito Ciancimino did not mark the end of his story. Rather, it opened a new and even more complex chapter, one defined by a precarious and controversial dance with the Italian state. Behind the cold walls of his prison, the man who had been the architect of the sack of Palermo now found himself in a position of unique and dangerous knowledge. He was a living repository of decades of secrets, a man who could name names, expose the intricate web of connections between the highest echelons of politics, business, and the Cosa Nostra. For magistrates like Giovanni Falcone, Ciancimino was not just a convicted criminal to be punished. He was a potential source of unparalleled insight, a key that could unlock countless other investigations and finally reveal the full, horrifying extent of the Mafia's penetration into the Italian state. This period saw Ciancimino gradually, and with immense calculation, begin to break the sacred code of omerta that had governed his entire life. His cooperation was never a full, repentant confession. It was a strategic negotiation, a series of carefully calibrated revelations offered in exchange for benefits, reduced sentences, and perhaps a sliver of legacy management. He began to talk, but he did so like a master chess player, revealing only enough to be valuable while potentially shielding even deeper, more explosive truths. He provided confirmation of details that investigators already suspected. He helped them interpret the complex language and symbolism of the Mafia. And he gave context to the mountain of financial and documentary evidence they were accumulating. His testimonies were a bizarre mix of chilling candor and stubborn evasion. He would openly admit to his membership in the Cosa Nostra, a fact he seemed almost proud of. Yet he would be deliberately vague on specific crimes or the involvement of other powerful figures, particularly those in the political realm who were still active and influential. This period of his life was a tightrope walk between two mortal dangers: the legal power of the state on one side, and the certain, bloody retaliation of his former Mafia associates on the other. The Mafia does not forgive traitors, and even from prison, Ciancimino knew his life was in perpetual jeopardy. His cooperation, however limited, contributed to the growing body of evidence that was being used in the historic Maxi trial of the mid-1980s, a monumental judicial effort led by Falcone and Borsellino that would ultimately convict hundreds of mafiosi and stand as a landmark moment in the fight against organized crime. Yet, for all the information he provided, Ciancimino remained an enigmatic and deeply controversial figure. To the families of the Mafia's countless victims, he was a monster who was being offered a deal with the devil, a man who deserved no leniency for his late in life attempts to bargain. To some investigators, he was a frustrating but necessary source, a man whose word had to be constantly cross-checked and whose motives were always suspect. He was released from prison in 1992, a frail man in his late 60s, his health deteriorating, but his mind still sharp, still holding secrets that could shake the foundations of Italy. He lived his final years in a state of semi-isolation, a known but unapproachable figure, a living ghost of Palermo's darkest era. His death on November 19, 2002, from a heart attack. It closed the final chapter on his physical life, but it did not end the debates and mysteries that swirled around him. In many ways, his death unleashed them, for it was after he was gone that the most startling allegations emerged, suggesting that his knowledge was even more profound than what he had shared. In the years following his passing, investigative journalists and magistracies began to piece together theories based on his cryptic hints and the evidence trail. That placed Vito Ciancimino at the very heart of one of Italy's most enduring and tragic mysteries, the kidnapping and murder of the teenage girl Giuseppe Di Matteo, a crime so heinous it was meant to silence his father, a Mafia turncoat, and the infamous bombings of 1993 that targeted cultural sites like the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, attacks that were seen as the Cosa Nostra's declaration of war on the Italian state itself. While direct, irrefutable proof remains elusive, the very fact that his name is so consistently mentioned in connection with these epochal events speaks to the shadow he cast, a shadow that stretched far beyond corrupt building permits and into the realm of terror and national trauma. His legacy is thus a double-edged sword. He was both a key that helped unlock the secrets of the Mafia and a man who may have taken the deepest, darkest secrets of all with him to his grave, a permanent, haunting question mark over the recent history of Italy. A ghost in the machine of the state that he so brilliantly and so corruptly manipulated for his own and his organization's ends. To truly grasp the magnitude of Vito Ciancimino's crime, one must move beyond the abstract concept of corruption and step into the physical reality of a city being eaten alive from the inside, a process for which the term sack of Palermo is not a metaphor, but a precise clinical diagnosis of urban murder. The engine of this destruction was the 1959 Master Plan, a document that was supposed to be a blueprint for orderly and beautiful growth, but was instead perverted into a weapon of mass construction, a legally sanctioned license for the Cosa Nostra to print money using concrete and rebar. The plan designated vast areas for new residential expansion, but it was in the hands of Ciancimino, first as assessor for public works and then as mayor, that its implementation became a criminal masterstroke. The method was as simple as it was devastating. The city's historic outskirts, particularly the areas to the north and west, were dotted with magnificent, often centuries-old villas, set in expansive private parks known as the Green Pearls of Palermo. These were oases of architectural grandeur and natural beauty, the last breaths of a more graceful and human, scaled city. Under Ciancimino's administration, these villas and their lands were systematically and mysteriously zoned from protected, low-density areas to zones designated for intense, high-rise residential development. The value of this land would instantly skyrocket, but it was only accessible to a very select group. The permits to demolish the villas and construct the new apartment blocks were issued with a speed and efficiency that defied all normal Italian bureaucratic practice, a clear signal that a higher, unspoken authority was at work. This authority was the consortium of Mafia families, led by powerful bosses like Totò Riina and Bernardo Provenzano of the Corleonesi clan, who had formed a cartel with a group of compliant, often related, construction entrepreneurs, men like Francesco Vassallo, who became known as the King of Cement. The process was a closed circuit of illicit gain. A builder would approach the dominant Mafia family in a specific area, seeking permission to acquire a particular plot of land. The clan, through its political guarantor Ciancimino, would ensure the land was rezoned and the permit granted. In return, the builder paid a substantial kickback, often amounting to a significant percentage of the total project cost, which was then divided between the Mafia clan and its political protectors within the city administration. The builder, now part of this protected system, was free to maximize his profits by using substandard materials, ignoring safety codes, and packing as many housing units as physically possible onto the land. The result was a catastrophic urban transformation. Neighborhoods like Nos, Passo di Regano, and especially the once elegant Ville della Liberte, were utterly obliterated, their character erased under a tidal wave of featureless, gray, and hastily built apartment blocks. The city's infrastructure, from sewage and water to roads and schools, could not keep pace with this explosive, chaotic growth, leading to a permanent state of urban crisis for the legitimate residents. The airy, garden city vision of the original 1959 plan was replaced by a suffocating, dense, and socially dysfunctional concrete jungle. The human cost was incalculable. Families who had lived for generations in communities with shared spaces and a sense of history were displaced and dispersed. The very soul of Palermo was scarred, its aesthetic and cultural heritage sacrificed at the altar of Mafia profit. This was not development. It was a form of strip mining, where the resource being extracted was the very livability and beauty of the city itself. The immense profits generated from the sack of Palermo, estimated in the hundreds of billions of lira, did not just line the pockets of a few mafiosi and corrupt politicians. It fundamentally altered the balance of power within Cosa Nostra itself. The traditional, somewhat more restrained, Palermo-based families found themselves challenged and eventually violently supplanted by the more ruthless and ambitious Corleonesi clan, who used this massive influx of capital to bankroll their bloody rise to the top of the criminal pyramid, financing their wars against rival families and their expansion into the global heroin trade. Thus, the concrete of Palermo's ruined skyline was mixed with the blood of the city's future victims. A direct line running from Ciancimino's signed permits in the town hall to the bullets of the lupara on the streets. He was not merely a corrupt official. He was the chief financial officer of a criminal corporation that was liquidating a city's assets. And the physical evidence of his work was not hidden in a secret bank account, but was towering over every citizen of Palermo every single day, a permanent, crushing monument to the day the Mafia moved into City Hall and decided to rebuild the city in its own grim and greedy image. The colossal enterprise of the sack of Palermo could never have been the work of one man. No matter how strategically placed he was, it was a symphony of corruption, and Vito Ciancimino was its conductor. But the musicians were the most feared and ruthless mafia bosses of the 20th century, men whose names would become synonymous with a level of brutality that shocked even the hardened sensibilities of Cosa Nostra's own traditionalists. To understand the full scope of Ciancimino's power, one must look into the shadows where he operated, to the figures of Salvatore, Totò, Riina, and Bernardo Provenzano, the architects of the Corleonesi faction's bloody ascent. The relationship between the politician and the killers was one of profound, cold, blooded symbiosis. Ciancimino provided the legitimacy, the official stamps, the political cover, and the keys to the city's treasury. In return, Riina and Provenzano provided the muscle, the intimidation, the absolute control over territory, and the unspoken threat of violence that ensured the system's smooth operation. Riina, known as the Beast for his ferocity, and Provenzano, known as the Tractor for his relentless, methodical nature, represented a new kind of mafioso. They were not from the sophisticated urban heart of Palermo, but from the rugged, inland town of Corleone. And they carried with them a peasant cunning and a breathtaking capacity for violence that the older Palermo families underestimated at their peril. Ciancimino, with his sharp political instincts, recognized the shifting tides of power within Cosa Nostra early on. He did not merely work with the Mafia as a monolithic entity. He strategically aligned himself with this rising, more aggressive faction. His network of patronage and his control over the building permits became a primary financial engine for the Corleoneses' war chest. The billions of lire extracted from the construction boom funded their purchase of weapons, their expansion into drug trafficking, and their campaign of terror against rival families. It was a direct pipeline of public money flowing from the municipal coffers through the hands of corrupt builders into the pockets of Riina and Provenzano, financing the very bullets that would be used in the Second Mafia War of the early 1980s, a conflict that would see hundreds of mafiosi murdered in the streets. Ciancimino was not a passive beneficiary of this relationship. He was an active and willing participant. He attended summits, he conveyed messages, he used his political influence to protect their interests and to warn them of impending police raids or investigations. He was, for all practical purposes, a member of their government, their Minister of Public Works. The depth of this alliance is chillingly illustrated by the fact that even after his arrest in 1984, the bonds held strong. There are persistent and credible allegations from pentiti, Mafia turncoats, that it was Ciancimino, from his prison cell, who helped the Corleonesi clan plan their strategy for the infamous 1992 murders of Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, using his knowledge of the state's legal and investigative machinery to advise on how to best strike at its heart. This relationship transcended business. It was a shared worldview, a joint project to dominate Sicily through a fusion of political legitimacy and raw criminal power. The calm, well-dressed engineer in his city hall office and the fugitive beasts hiding in farmhouses were two sides of the same coin. One the public face of a system whose hidden, brutal reality was enforced by the other. They needed each other absolutely. Without Riina and Provenzano's terror, Ciancimino's decrees could be challenged. Without Ciancimino's signatures, Riina and Provenzano's ambitions would be limited to extorting shopkeepers and trafficking in drugs. Together, they became an unstoppable force, a hybrid entity that corrupted the very idea of governance, turning the democratic process into a front for a criminal dictatorship. The story of Vito Ciancimino is therefore inseparable from the story of the Corleonesi. His political rise enabled their criminal ascendancy, and their criminal ascendancy, in turn, protected and financed his political power. It was a perfect, self-sustaining circuit of corruption and violence, a dark marriage between the suit and the lupara, whose toxic legacy would poison an entire generation and leave scars on the soul of Sicily that are still tender to the touch today. A permanent reminder of what happens when the line between the state and the mafia is not just crossed, but systematically erased. While the alliance of Ciancimino, Riina, and Provenzano seemed to wield an unassailable monopoly on power, casting a long and seemingly impenetrable shadow over Palermo, their dominion was never absolute. In the very heart of the city they sought to control, a resistance was quietly, courageously taking root, a movement composed of a few brave magistrates, journalists, and citizens who refused to surrender their city to the forces of corruption and violence. This struggle was not a grand, organized army, but a scattered yet determined collection of voices speaking truth to power, often at the ultimate personal cost. One of the most poignant and prophetic of these voices belonged to a young journalist and activist from Sinisi, a small town near Palermo named Giuseppe Impastato, born into a family with its own mafia connections. Impastato possessed an intimate understanding of the culture he grew to despise. In the late 1970s, he used his radio show, Radio 8, to wage a satirical and relentless war against the Mafia, mocking their pompous rituals and, with breathtaking bravery, naming names. He famously referred to the powerful Mafia boss, Gaetano Badalamenti, as Tano Seduto, a play on Toro Seduto, or Sitting Bull, ridiculing his authority. But Impastato's sharpest barbs were also aimed at the political protectors, the network of which Ciancimino was a central pillar. He understood and loudly proclaimed that the Mafia could not exist without the complicity of the politicians, that the concrete cancer of the sack of Palermo was a joint venture between criminals in suits and criminals in the shadows. His voice, clear and defiant, became a beacon for a growing, albeit fearful, public sentiment. This beacon was brutally extinguished on May 9, 1978, when Giuseppe Impastato was murdered by a bomb placed on a railway line. His body horrifically mutilated in an attempt by the Mafia to frame his death as a botched terrorist attack. His murder was a stark message to anyone who dared to speak out, a testament to the price of dissent in Ciancimino's Palermo. Yet, his death was not the end of his message. It was the beginning of his legend, a seed of rebellion that would eventually bear fruit. Around the same time, within the very institutions the Mafia had infiltrated, a new generation of magistrates was beginning to connect the dots. Young, brilliant, and fiercely dedicated prosecutors like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, working from the bunker like courthouse in Palermo, were developing a revolutionary new approach to fighting the Mafia. They moved away from treating Mafia crimes as isolated acts of violence and began to see Cosa Nostra for what it was: a sophisticated hierarchical corporation, a hostile state within a state. Falcone, with his meticulous, analytical mind, pioneered the use of financial forensics, following the money trails that led from the bloody streets of Palermo to secret bank accounts in Switzerland. Borsellino, with his passionate and human touch, built trusting relationships with the first major pentiti, or Mafia turncoats, like Tommaso Buscetta, understanding that to dismantle the organization, one must first understand its inner workings, its rules, its language. Their investigations inevitably led them to the nexus of political and Mafia power, and the trail consistently pointed toward one man, Vito Ciancimino. They saw how his political career was a facade for his Mafia membership, how his signatures on public works contracts were, in effect, executive orders for a criminal enterprise. The work of Falcone and Borsellino was conducted under constant, mortal threat. They lived under armed guard, their lives reduced to a grim shuttle between their fortified homes and their fortified offices, a constant reminder of the power of the enemy they faced. The enemy was not just the fugitive Riina. It was the entire system Ciancimino represented, the system of political complicity, of silenced witnesses, of public indifference born from fear. The murders of Falcone and Borsellino in 1992, two of the most devastating blows the Italian state has ever suffered, were, in a very real sense, the ultimate consequence of the system that Ciancimino helped build and sustain. They were killed because they were getting too close, because their maxi trial had successfully convicted hundreds of mafiosi based on the very financial and political connections Ciancimino embodied, and because they were preparing to investigate even higher into the realm of national politics. The story of the resistance to Ciancimino's power is therefore a tragic one, written in the blood of its bravest champions. But it is also a story of profound moral victory. For while the Mafia could plant bombs and silence individual voices, they could not kill the ideas of justice, legality, and civic duty that these men and women represented. The deaths of Impastato, Falcone, and Borsellino did not, as the Mafia had hoped, end the fight. They galvanized it, turning them into martyrs and awakening the conscience of a nation, forcing the Italian state to finally and with full force, confront the monster that Vito Ciancimino had so expertly helped to nurture and place in its very midst. The culmination of the decades-long struggle between the Italian state and the Cosa Nostra, the event that would force the shadows into a blinding legal spotlight, was the historic Maxi trial, which unfolded between February 1986 and December 1987 in a specially constructed, bomb-proof bunker courtroom in Palermo. This was not merely a trial, it was a national reckoning, a direct judicial assault on the very heart of the Mafia's power structure, built upon the revolutionary investigative methods of Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. The foundation of the trial was the testimonies of the pentiti, the Mafia turncoats, most notably Tommaso Buscetta, whose detailed confessions provided the first comprehensive map of Cosa Nostra's secretive hierarchy, its rules, and its murderous activities. For the first time, the state was prosecuting the Mafia not as a loose collection of criminal gangs, but as a single, unified, and hostile organization, a strategy that directly targeted the bosses who had long operated with a sense of untouchable impunity. And sitting in the docket, among hundreds of other defendants, was Vito Ciancimino, the former mayor, the living proof of the prosecution's central thesis that the Mafia and the state were not separate entities, but had become fatally intertwined. His presence in the courtroom was a spectacle in itself, a symbol of the trial's profound ambition. The evidence against him was overwhelming, a meticulous paper trail of corruption that connected his political decisions directly to the financial enrichment of the Mafia's most violent clans. The permits he signed, the rezoning he authorized, the contracts he directed to specific builders, all were laid bare, no longer as isolated acts of corruption, but as integral components of a criminal conspiracy to loot the city. The testimony of the pentiti further solidified his position, placing him at meetings, confirming his status as a man of honor, and detailing his role as the crucial political link for the Corleonesi faction. For the public watching the trial, Ciancimino became the face of this high-level betrayal, the respectable facade that had hidden a ruthless criminal enterprise. The trial was a dramatic, tense, and dangerous affair, conducted under the constant threat of Mafia retaliation, with judges, prosecutors, and jurors living in a state of siege. Yet, it preceded a monumental feat of judicial courage. When the verdicts were finally read, they sent shockwaves around the world. 360 convictions, including 19 life sentences for the most senior Mafia bosses. Vito Ciancimino was found guilty of Mafia association and corruption and was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The verdict was a stunning victory for Falcone, Borsellino, and the anti-Mafia movement, a moment that felt like a decisive turning point in the long, dark history of the Cosa Nostra. However, the story of Ciancimino and the Maxi trial does not end with his conviction. In many ways, that was merely the end of the beginning. The appeals process, influenced by a still powerful Mafia lobby and a lingering cultural reluctance to fully accept the pentiti's testimonies as absolute truth, would later overturn many of the convictions, a devastating blow that demonstrated the Mafia's enduring ability to manipulate the system. But for Ciancimino, prison became a new kind of headquarters, isolated from the outside world, but holding a treasure trove of secrets in his mind. He began a delicate and calculated new phase of his life. He realized that his knowledge was his last and most valuable currency. Slowly, cautiously, he began to talk. He never became a full pentito in the tradition of Becerra. He did not express remorse or fully renounce his past. Instead, he became a collaborator of sorts, a connoisseur of secrets who would feed information to magistrates, confirming facts, explaining Mafia protocols, and providing context that helped investigators interpret other evidence. This cooperation was a complex negotiation, a strategic game where he traded fragments of his immense knowledge for small improvements in his conditions, for a sense of continued relevance, and perhaps for a twisted attempt to shape his own historical legacy. He was playing both sides, even from his cell, maintaining a connection to his old world while bargaining with the new one that had imprisoned him. The Maxi trial, therefore, did not simply imprison Vito Ciancimino, it transformed him. It broke him out of the political sphere and placed him squarely in a judicial one, forcing his hidden knowledge into a controlled, legal arena. He was no longer just a defendant. He had become a unique and controversial resource, a man who held the keys to understanding not just the crimes of the past, but the structure of the power that still remained. The trial had exposed the body of the beast, but Ciancimino, in his cold, calculating way, began to offer glimpses into its nervous system, ensuring that even from behind bars, he would remain a central, enigmatic, and deeply troubling figure in the ongoing and bloody drama of the war against the Mafia. The initial victory of the Maxi trial proved to be tragically fragile, a brief moment of light before a storm of unimaginable violence that would plunge Italy into a period of national mourning and terror. The overturning of many convictions on appeal was perceived by the Corleonesi clan, led by the fugitives, taught Riina and Bernardo Provenzano, not as a legal technicality, but as a sign of the state's inherent weakness and a green light to launch an all-out war against the Italian Republic itself. This was the beginning of a terrifying new strategy. Rather than hiding in the shadows, the Mafia would strike directly and spectacularly at the symbols of the state, seeking to terrorize it into submission and force the repeal of the harsh anti-Mafia laws that had been born from the Maxi trial. It was in this crucible of fire and blood that the figure of Vito Ciancimino, now imprisoned, but far from powerless, takes on an even more sinister and controversial dimension. From his cell, he remained a vital strategic node, a man whose deep understanding of the state's inner workings and legal machinery made him a valuable consultant to his old allies on the outside. According to the later testimonies of other pentiti, it was Ciancimino who, during permitted meetings with his lawyers and through carefully crafted messages, analyzed the appellate court's decisions and helped the Mafia strategize its next moves. He was, in effect, acting as a political and legal advisor to a criminal organization that was now declaring war on the nation. This chilling role reached its horrifying apex with the meticulously planned and executed assassinations of Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino in 1992. The murder of Falcone on May 23, 1992, was an act of military precision that shook the world. A half-ton of explosives buried in a drainage culture under the highway near Capaci was detonated as his motorcade passed, killing him, his wife Francesca Morvillo, and 3 members of his police escort. The investigation into the massacre would reveal a plot of terrifying complexity, requiring detailed knowledge of Falcone's travel plans, the structural weaknesses of the highway, and the logistics of planting such a large quantity of explosives without detection. The subsequent murder of Paolo Borsellino just 57 days later by a car bomb outside his mother's apartment building in Palermo, which also killed 5 members of his security detail, confirmed that this was a systematic decapitation of the state's anti-Mafia leadership. The sheer audacity and brutality of these attacks pointed to a level of strategic planning that went beyond mere thuggery. It required intelligence, patience, and an intimate understanding of how the state operated. And at the center of the investigation into who could have masterminded such sophisticated strikes, the name of Vito Ciancimino repeatedly surfaced. While he was physically behind bars, his mind was not. Prosecutors theorized that his unique position, his hatred for the magistrates who had imprisoned him, his unwavering loyalty to the Corleonesi cause, and his deep insider's knowledge of the procedures and vulnerabilities of Falcone's and Borsellino's security protocols made him ideal architect of revenge. He could advise on the best ways to monitor the magistrates. He could understand the significance of certain patterns in their movements, and he could provide a cold, analytical assessment of the political impact such attacks would have. The bombings of 1993 in Rome, Milan, and Florence at cultural sites like the Uffizi Gallery, which were part of this same terror campaign, further suggested a strategic mind capable of thinking on a national, psychological level, a mind that many investigators believe was influenced by Ciancimino's counsel. This period represents the absolute darkest chapter in Ciancimino's story, the point where his corruption evolved into something even more monstrous, alleged complicity in acts of terrorism aimed at breaking the will of a nation. The public grief and national outrage that followed the deaths of Falcone and Borsellino, however, created a backlash that even the Mafia had not anticipated. Hundreds of thousands of citizens took to the streets in silent, angry protest, and the state, finally shamed into action, responded with a massive crackdown, passing new emergency powers and arresting thousands of mafiosi, including the elusive Totò Riina himself in January 1993. In a bitter twist of fate, the very war that Ciancimino may have helped plan ultimately led to the downfall of his own protectors and the further erosion of the system he had built, proving that the state, when truly united and determined, could indeed fight back, but at a cost so horrifically high that its memory remains an open wound in the heart of every Italian who lived through those dark days. The capture of Totò Riina in 1993 marked the beginning of the end for the old Cosa Nostra order, and for Vito Ciancimino, it signaled the closing act of his own long and dark drama. Released from prison in 1992 due to his deteriorating health, a frail and elderly man suffering from heart disease, he was now navigating a world that had been fundamentally altered by the very violence he was accused of helping to inspire. He was free, but his freedom was a precarious one, lived out in a state of semi-seclusion, a known and watched figure, a ghost from Palermo's most traumatic era. These final years were not spent in quiet retirement, but in a continued, intricate dance with the magistrates who had never ceased their pursuit of the full truth. The state, armed with new evidence and a renewed determination following the massacres of 1992 and 1993, was now investigating the very political heart of the Mafia's power, and Ciancimino remained the most vital living source. His cooperation evolved during this period, becoming more substantial yet always remaining calculated and self-serving. He was re-arrested in 1993 and again in 1996. But these incarcerations were as much about controlling him as a witness as they were about punishment. He began to provide more detailed information, not out of repentance, but as a final strategic play. He confirmed the existence of a secret negotiation between segments of the Italian state and the Mafia following the bombings of 1993. A desperate attempt to stop the terror, a revelation that shook the political establishment to its core. He gave investigators crucial insights into the cryptic messages and communication methods of Bernardo Provenzano, who had now succeeded Riina as the top fugitive. Information that would prove invaluable in the long hunt that eventually led to Provenzano's capture in 2006. He spoke more openly about the sack of Palermo, providing the names of other politicians and bureaucrats who had facilitated the great looting, and he confirmed the Mafia's direct involvement in the murders of Falcone and Borsellino, though he carefully distanced himself from direct responsibility, portraying himself as an informed observer rather than an active planner. This late in life collaboration was a paradox. To the magistrates, he was a frustrating but indispensable fountain of information, a man whose every word had to be meticulously verified against other evidence, but whose confirmations could break open cold cases and unlock long-held secrets. To the families of the Mafia's countless victims, he was a monster being offered a platform, a man whose belated talks could never atone for a lifetime of crime and betrayal. And to his former Mafia associates, he was now a definitive traitor, a man living on borrowed time. He spent his last years shuttling between his home and courtrooms, a spectral figure in a suit, his body failing, but his eyes still holding their sharp, calculating glint. He was a man trying to manage his own legacy, to control the narrative of his life as his physical life ebbed away. He wanted to be remembered not just as a gangster, but as a man of power and influence, a key player in the great game between the state and its hidden enemy. On November 19, 2002, his heart, which had beaten at the center of so much corruption and controversy, finally gave out. Vito Ciancimino died in a Roman clinic, not in Palermo, the city he had helped to destroy, His death closed the final chapter on his physical existence, but it unleashed a torrent of speculation and unresolved questions. In the years immediately following his passing, investigators acting on his cryptic hints and their own mounting evidence began to formally name him as a key suspect in the planning of the 1992 and 1993 massacres. They alleged that his role was central, that his political cunning and his deep-seated vendetta against Falcone and Borsellino made him the intellectual author of the terror campaign. His death meant he would never stand trial for these, his greatest alleged crimes, leaving a permanent stain of unatoned guilt on his memory. His legacy is thus a profoundly divided one. He was a man who, from a humble beginning, built an empire of corruption that fused politics and organized crime into a single, terrifying entity. He was the engineer of the sack of Palermo, an act of urban vandalism on a historic scale. He was a bridge between the old, somewhat restrained Mafia and the new, terrorist Cosa Nostra of the Corleonesi. And in his final years, he became a unique, compromised source, a man who helped the state understand the monster he had helped to create, all while never fully admitting his own monstrousness. He is a permanent reminder of the fragility of democratic institutions, a cautionary tale of how easily public trust can be perverted into private gain, and a ghost that still haunts the concrete landscape of modern Palermo, a city forever marked by his signature. To truly appreciate the chilling efficiency of Vito Ciancimino's criminal enterprise, one must move beyond the broad strokes of the sack of Palermo and descend into the granular, bureaucratic mechanics of how he systematically looted a city, transforming the dry, administrative processes of urban planning into a well-oiled machine for illicit wealth creation. The system was not one of chaotic greed, but of meticulous, almost corporate, organization, a corrupt assembly line where each step was designed to maximize profit and minimize risk. It began with intelligence gathering. The Mafia clans, through their control of neighborhoods and their networks of informants, would identify potential target areas, those historic villas with large, undervalued plots of land, often owned by aging aristocrats or heirs who had moved away and were unaware of the land's potential new value. A builder, already vetted and approved by the clan, would then approach the owner with an offer to purchase the property. The offer was rarely negotiable. It was an offerta che non puoi rifiutare, an offer you can't refuse, backed by the implicit threat of violence or the certainty that without Mafia approval, no development would ever be possible. Once the land was acquired at a depressed price, the next, most critical step was the rezoning. And this is where Ciancimino's power as assessor for public works became absolute. The official 1959 master plan had designated many of these areas as Zona A or Zona B, which were meant for low-density residential villas or public green spaces, protecting them from intensive development. Ciancimino's office would wield a tool known as the variante, or variant, a legal provision intended for minor adjustments to the master plan. In his hands, the variante became a weapon of mass construction. He would authorize thousands of these variants, systematically and illegally changing the designation of protected land to Zona C, which permitted high-density, high-rise apartment blocks. This was not done through a transparent public process, but through a flurry of internal memos, backdated documents, and signatures that bypassed all normal committees and oversight. The sheer volume of these varianti was itself a red flag, a blizzard of paper that obscured individual acts of corruption within a larger storm. Once the land was illegally re-zoned, the building permit would be issued with breathtaking speed, often within days or weeks, while legitimate applications from builders outside the Mafia's circle could languish for years in bureaucratic purgatory. This speed was the ultimate signal of Ciancimino's involvement, a clear message to the entire construction industry about who held the real power. The kickback, known as the tangente, was the financial engine of the entire operation. It was not a casual bribe, but a formalized percentage, often ranging from 5 to 10% of the total contract value, though it could be much higher for particularly lucrative projects. This money did not go directly to Ciancimino in a briefcase, though that certainly happened for smaller sums. For the large-scale projects, the payments were laundered through a complex web of front companies, fake invoices for non-existent services, and offshore bank accounts. Some funds were reinvested into Ciancimino's political machine, financing his electoral campaigns and ensuring his continued power. The rest was divided between the Mafia clan that controlled the territory and Ciancimino's own personal wealth, which he invested in property, businesses, and a life of luxury that was utterly incongruous with his official salary. The final step was the construction itself, which was a study in maximizing profit through criminal cost cutting. The new apartment blocks were thrown up with scandalous speed, using substandard, often dangerous materials, ignoring building codes for earthquake resistance, fire safety, and basic structural integrity. The green spaces that were legally required for new developments were never built, and the new neighborhoods were constructed without the necessary infrastructure: schools, parks, adequate sewage, and water systems, creating instant ghettos and overburdening the city's services for decades to come. This entire process, from the initial threat to the final, shoddily constructed building, was a perfect, closed loop. The Mafia provided the muscle and the territorial control. The corrupt builder provided the capital and the construction crews, and Vito Ciancimino, sitting in his city hall office, provided the legal authority and the bureaucratic smokescreen. It was a syndicate that operated with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company, but its product was urban blight. Its currency was fear, and its legacy was a city physically and morally scarred, a permanent monument to the day that public service was officially redefined as a criminal enterprise. The true cost of Vito Ciancimino's reign of corruption cannot be measured in lyre or square meters of concrete alone. Its most enduring and tragic legacy was etched into the very soul of Palermo and the psyche of its citizens, a deep social wound that infected every aspect of daily life and fundamentally altered the city's relationship with itself. The sack of Palermo was not merely an architectural crime. It was a form of social engineering, as brutal and calculated as any war, a deliberate dismantling of community, history, and civic trust, as the historic villas, the green pearls, that provided lungs and beauty to the urban landscape, were systematically demolished. Something more than buildings was being lost. These villas were not just private residences, they were landmarks, repositories of local memory and identity, physical anchors to a shared past that was being bulldozed into oblivion to make way for a generic, soulless future. The rapid unplanned and greed-driven construction frenzy created monstrous new neighborhoods that were social vacuums. The narrow, intimate streets of the old city, which fostered community interaction and a sense of belonging, were replaced by wide, traffic, choked thoroughfares and towering, anonymous apartment blocks that isolated people from one another, creating vertical silos of existence where neighbors became strangers and the traditional social fabric of the city unraveled. This sudden, chaotic urban growth, devoid of the necessary supporting infrastructure, created instant ghettos. New populations were dumped into areas without schools, without parks for children to play, without adequate medical clinics, without proper public transport, and often without even reliable running water or sewage systems. The city government, itself the author of this chaos, was incapable of responding to the needs it had created, leading to a permanent state of crisis and neglect that bred resentment and alienation among the new residents. This environment became a fertile breeding ground for the very criminality that had created it. The Mafia, having orchestrated this social dislocation, stepped into the vacuum left by the absent state. For the young men growing up in these concrete jungles, with limited opportunities and a pervasive sense of abandonment, the Mafia offered a perverse alternative social ladder, a path to power, respect, and wealth in a world that seemed to offer them nothing else. The Cosa Nostra became a parallel government, providing illicit jobs, settling disputes, and offering a twisted form of welfare, thereby ensnaring another generation into its culture of silence and complicity. Beyond the physical and social destruction, the sack of Palermo inflicted a profound psychological trauma on the citizenry. The sight of their beautiful city being devoured by concrete, the brazenness with which the destruction was carried out, and the obvious impunity of the perpetrators created a culture of deep-seated cynicism and powerlessness. People understood that the official authorities, the police, the politicians, were not just failing to protect them, but were active participants in the looting. This eroded the very concept of the common good, replacing it with a grim individualism and a survivalist mentality. Trust, the glue that holds any society together, evaporated. You could not trust your neighbor, who might be an informant. You could not trust the builder, who was using stolen materials, and you most certainly could not trust the man in the town hall, whose signature was for sale to the highest bidder. This atmosphere of fear and suspicion suffocated civic life and silenced dissent, as the brutal murders of activists like Giuseppe Impastato made terrifyingly clear. The city's unique cultural identity, a layered tapestry of Arab, Norman, and Spanish influences expressed in its architecture and urban layout, was being replaced by a homogenized, international style of bland functionality that had no connection to Sicilian history or climate. The loss of these physical spaces meant the loss of settings for community festivals, for family gatherings, for the simple, everyday interactions that give a city its character and its heart. Palermo was being stripped of its memory, its beauty, and its spirit, transformed into a mere real estate portfolio for Mafia investment. The psychological impact of living in a city that was actively, visibly, and officially being destroyed around them created a collective trauma, a form of civic grief for a lost home, a sentiment captured perfectly by the title of a famous book about the period, The Death of a City. This was the ultimate success of Ciancimino's system. It didn't just steal money. It stole a city's future. It broke its social bonds, and it poisoned the very well of public trust, leaving behind a population grappling with a legacy of beauty lost, community shattered, and a deep, lingering question of whether a city so profoundly wounded could ever truly heal. Vito Ciancimino was not a singular anomaly, a lone criminal who miraculously infiltrated a pristine political system. He was, rather, the ultimate and most brazen product of a deeply compromised and intricate political ecosystem that had evolved in post-war Italy, and particularly in Sicily, where the conditions were uniquely fertile for the symbiosis of organized crime and state power. To understand how a man of his background and allegiances could not only enter politics, but ascend to its highest municipal office, one must look beyond the man and into the turbulent world of Italian Christian democracy, the Cold War pressures that shaped it, and the historical role of the Mafia as a perceived political tool in the aftermath of World War II and the fall of fascism, which had temporarily suppressed the Mafia through brutal force. Italy was reborn as a republic, but it was a republic living on a profound fault line. The Christian Democracy Party, or Democrazia Christiana, emerged as the dominant political force, positioning itself as the essential bulwark against the rising tide of the Italian Communist Party, which was particularly strong in the central regions of the country. This anti-communist crusade became the overriding, all-justifying principle of the DC's political strategy for decades. In Sicily, with its deep-seated feudal traditions, widespread poverty, and a historically weak central state presence, the DC needed local power brokers who could deliver blocks of votes and guarantee political stability. They found these brokers in a class of individuals known as Gattipardi, the Lippards, a term borrowed from the famous novel, referring to those who change their coats to maintain their power. These were local notables, often with dubious connections, who could mobilize entire communities using a mixture of patronage, favors, and intimidation. The Mafia, reconstituting itself after the fascist years, perfectly fit this description. For the national DC leadership in Rome, an alliance with Southern Gattipardi, like Ciancimino, was a pragmatic, if morally bankrupt, necessity. They turned a blind eye to the sources of their local allies' power, so long as those allies could produce electoral victories and keep the communists from gaining a foothold on the island. This created a system of reciprocal, willful blindness. Rome got its votes and its anti-communist shield, and the Mafia linked local bosses got something infinitely more valuable: impunity and access to the levers of state power. This was the second level of the Mafia's strategy, moving beyond simple rural intimidation into the very heart of political and economic life. Ciancimino was a master of this system. He understood that his value to the National Party was his ability to control his fiefdom in Palermo, and he used his Mafia connections to do precisely that, delivering monolithic electoral results for the Christian Democrats in his wards. In return, the National Party protected him for years, ignoring the mounting evidence of his criminality, viewing him as an unsavory but effective tool. This protection extended to the highest levels. Ciancimino enjoyed relationships with powerful national figures like Giulio Andreotti, a seven-time prime minister, whose eventual trial for Mafia association would reveal the terrifying proximity between the highest offices of the state and the criminal underworld. The system was further enabled by a general climate of clientelismo, a patronage system where votes were exchanged for favors, a job for a son, a pension for a grandmother, a building permit for a cousin. Ciancimino excelled at this, presenting himself as a man of the people in the Calza neighborhood, while simultaneously operating as a man of the Mafia. This created a perverse form of consensus for many citizens. Disenfranchised by a distant and often indifferent state, the local boss who could get things done was a more tangible and reliable authority than a faceless bureaucrat in Rome. The Mafia, through politicians like Ciancimino, inserted itself into this clientelist network, becoming the hidden engine of the local economy and administration. Furthermore, the very structure of the Italian state, with its Byzantine bureaucracy and slow, opaque judicial processes, provided the perfect smokescreen for corruption. The complex procedures for issuing building permits, for instance, were not a barrier to Ciancimino, they were a weapon. He could walk legitimate applications to a crawl while fast, tracking his own corrupt ones, creating a system where only those who paid the tangente or had the right connections could navigate the maze. This was the ecosystem that bred, nurtured, and protected Vito Ciancimino. It was a world where the fight against communism justified any alliance, where patronage replaced policy, where bureaucratic complexity served to hide illicit activity, and where the lines between the state, the political party, and the criminal organization became so blurred as to be virtually invisible. He did not corrupt a pure system. He mastered a system that was already inherently vulnerable to corruption, becoming its most successful and most terrifying graduate, a living testament to a political culture where the deal, the favor, and the hidden connection always trumped the law, the public good, and the truth. The enduring power of the system that Vito Ciancimino represented cannot be fully understood without examining the complex and often ambivalent role played by other pillars of Sicilian society, namely the Catholic Church, and the legitimate business community, institutions that possess the potential to be powerful forces of opposition, but which, for a complex mix of complicity, fear, and misguided pragmatism, largely failed to mount an effective resistance, thereby creating a permissive environment where his power could flourish almost unchallenged. The Catholic Church in Sicily, with its deep historical roots and immense moral authority, was in a unique position to denounce the Mafia and its political allies from the pulpit and through its vast network of parishes. Yet, for decades, the institutional church maintained a stance of profound ambiguity. There were, of course, courageous individual priests like Padre Pino Puglisi, who would later be martyred for his work in educating Palermo's youth against the lure of the Mafia, but they were the exception. The hierarchy, including many bishops and cardinals, often remained silent, or worse, engaged in a policy of appeasement and coexistence. This was driven by several factors. There was a long-standing tradition of intertwining religious and Mafia ritual, with mafiosi acting as prominent patrons of local feast days and church renovations, a practice that created a veneer of respectability and fostered a dangerous confusion between faith and criminal culture. Furthermore, the Church's primary political focus, shared with the Christian Democrat Party, was the fight against communism. This led many within the hierarchy to view the Mafia, for all its sins, as a lesser evil compared to the atheist left, a bulwark of social order in a potentially volatile region. This created a de facto, unspoken alliance where the Church would not interfere with the Mafia's criminal and political operations so long as the Mafia did not challenge the Church's social and moral primacy and helped maintain the anti-communist status quo. This silence was deafening. When a figure like Ciancimino, a known Mafia associate, could publicly attend Mass and be seen shaking hands with clergy, it sent a powerful message to the faithful that such men were not beyond the pale, that their power was legitimate, or at least tolerable. It wasn't until the pontificate of John Paul and the courageous stance of later Palermitan cardinals, like Salvatore Pappalardo, who famously denounced the Mafia from the cathedral steps after the murder of General Dalla Chiesa, that the institutional church began to find its voice. But for the critical decades of the sack of Palermo, its silence was a form of passive consent that Ciancimino and his allies expertly exploited. Similarly, the legitimate business community in Palermo, those entrepreneurs and industrialists not part of the Mafia's inner circle, found themselves trapped in an impossible dilemma. To speak out against Ciancimino's system was to invite economic ruin or worse. The Mafia's control was not limited to construction. It extended to all sectors through extortion. The pizzo, a business owner who refused to pay or who dared to publicly criticize the political Mafia nexus, could see their premises burned, their trucks vandalized, or themselves and their families threatened with death. This created a climate of terror that effectively muzzled the very class that should have been a natural advocate for transparent, rule-based commerce. Many businesses simply adapted, factoring the pizzo into their operating costs. as a kind of criminal tax, a bitter but necessary price for survival. Others, seeing the astronomical profits to be made in the construction boom, made a Faustian bargain, choosing to collaborate with the system, becoming the white-collar Mafia, the respectable fronts who laundered money and provided a veneer of legitimacy to the illicit gains. For those who remained outside the system, competing for public contracts was a futile exercise. The bids were rigged, the specifications tailored to favored companies, and the outcome predetermined in Ciancimino's office. This systematically corrupted the market, rewarding not efficiency or innovation, but connections and a willingness to engage in criminality. It drove honest businesses into bankruptcy or forced them to relocate to the more regulated north of Italy, further impoverishing Sicily's legitimate economy and deepening its dependence on the illicit one. The combined effect of the church's initial silence and the business community's coerced compliance or active collaboration was to create a suffocating social consensus around Ciancimino's power. There were no powerful, unified voices from these major institutions to counter the narrative that the Mafia's control was inevitable or to offer a viable alternative. This left the field open for the corrupt politicians and the mafiosi to act with impunity, and it left the ordinary citizens, the true victims of the sack of Palermo, isolated and powerless, believing that no one, not their priests, not their business leaders, and certainly not their government, could or would save them from the concrete tide that was engulfing their city and the culture of fear that was poisoning their lives. To comprehend the full dimensions of Vito Ciancimino's story, one must venture beyond the court transcripts and the political analysis and peer into the more intimate, shadowy realm of his personal life and inner world, a space where the contradictions of the public figure, the devout family man, and the ruthless mafia operative coexisted in a complex and unsettling harmony. Unlike the flamboyant, volatile gangsters of popular imagination, Ciancimino cultivated an image of bourgeois respectability and quiet authority. He was a man of simple, almost austere personal tastes. He did not flaunt his immense illicit wealth with garish displays, but invested it in property and businesses, building a solid, unassuming fortune for his family. He was married to Epicarmia Lipuma and was a father, and by all accounts, he was deeply devoted to his children, striving to provide them with the security and opportunities he had lacked in his own humble beginnings. This domestic sphere was a carefully maintained sanctuary, a world apart from the brutal negotiations and corrupt dealings of his public life. He was known to be a man of faith, regularly attending Mass, yet this piety existed in a baffling parallel universe with his criminal activities, a cognitive dissonance that he seemed to navigate without apparent difficulty. This points to a psychology not of a psychopath devoid of all feeling, but of a man who had constructed rigid mental compartments, where the rules governing his family life and his criminal life were entirely separate. His loyalty was fierce, but it was tribal and conditional, extending primarily to his blood family and his mafia family, the Cosa Nostra. which he considered his true community, a state within a state that demanded and received his absolute allegiance. To outsiders, to the citizens of Palermo he was sworn to serve, he felt no such obligation. They were merely pawns in a vast game of power and enrichment. This mindset was rooted in a Sicilian particularism, a deep-seated belief that the official state was a foreign, predatory entity to be exploited, and that true honor and success lay in advancing the interests of one's own clan by any means necessary. He viewed his political career not as a platform for public service, but as a weapon and a shield for his criminal organization. There was no conflict in his mind between holding the office of mayor and being a man of honor. In fact, the two roles were synergistic, one empowering the other. This is why, even in his later cooperation with magistrates, he never expressed remorse for his actions. He would admit to them matter of factly as strategic necessities in a war for control. He was proud of his power and his influence, seeing himself as a key strategist, the engineer of a grand design. His charisma was not of the warm, gregarious kind, but rather a cold, magnetic authority born of certainty and the silent promise of power. He commanded rooms not by raising his voice, but through a calm, imposing presence and a reputation for getting things done. A reputation that was equally based on his political acumen and the unspoken threat of the Mafia's violence that stood behind him. He was a man who loved secrecy and codes, finding satisfaction in the intricate dance of hidden messages and clandestine meetings, in being the one who pulled the levers from behind the curtain. This love for the hidden mechanics of power made his eventual, calculated decision to break Omert and speak to magistrates all the more complex. It was not a breakdown of his character, but a recalculation of his strategy, a move in a continuing game where his knowledge was his last remaining asset. In his final years, as his health failed and he faced his mortality, he seemed preoccupied with his legacy, not as a repentant sinner, but as a historic figure. He wanted to be remembered as a player of the great game, a man who had shaped the destiny of his city, even if that shape was a scar. The private Vito Ciancimino remains an enigma, a man who could read a bedtime story to his children and then, in the same day, authorize a decision that would lead to the murder of a rival or the destruction of a historic landmark. This was not a Jekyll and Hyde transformation, but a unified, if terrifying, whole. A man who had successfully integrated a capacity for profound familial love with a capacity for systemic. Calculated evil, believing until the end that his primary duty was to his own, and that the world beyond was a territory to be conquered and controlled, a city not to be served, but to be sacked. While the story of Vito Ciancimino is deeply rooted in the unique soil of Sicilian history and culture, its themes of political corruption, the fusion of state and criminal power, and the systematic looting of public resources through urban development are tragically universal, echoing in various forms across the globe and throughout modern history, offering a chilling case study in a specific pathology of power that transcends national borders. The phenomenon of the Mafia state, or the captured state, where criminal interests effectively co-opt the institutions of government, is not an Italian invention, though Ciancimino's Palermo represents one of its most brazen and fully realized examples. One can look to the rise of the drug cartels in Colombia, particularly the Medellin cartel under Pablo Escobar, and observe a parallel trajectory of criminal accumulation of wealth leading to direct political infiltration. Like the Cosa Nostra, the cartels initially used violence to control their illicit trade, but their ambitions quickly expanded. They sought legitimacy and protection by bankrolling politicians, intimidating or murdering those who opposed them, and even securing the election of their own sympathizers to Congress, a campaign known as Plata o Plomo, silver or lead. Escobar himself was briefly elected as an alternate member of Colombia's Congress, using his position to lobby against extradition treaties. Just as Ciancimino used his office to direct building contracts, the scale of violence was different, more overt and terroristic, but the underlying strategy was the same: to neutralize the state by becoming part of it. In post-Soviet Russia, the chaotic transition to a market economy in the 1990s created a golden age for organized criminal groups who, in alliance with corrupt officials and former KGB operatives, engaged in the wholesale looting of state assets, a process of privatization that was, in essence, a larger scale sack of Moscow. Oligarchs with murky pasts amassed fortunes by acquiring national industries for a pittance, using a mixture of political connections and brutal force, effectively capturing the state's economic levers and, for a time, its political direction as well. The phenomenon even appears in established democracies. The pervasive corruption of the Tammany Hall political machine in 19th century New York, which controlled municipal contracts and appointments in a system of patronage and kickbacks, shares a clear lineage with Ciancimino's methods, albeit without the overt element of murderous terror. What makes Ciancimino's case particularly instructive, however, is the cold, bureaucratic, and long-term nature of his project. It was not a brief, violent takeover, but a patient, decades-long colonization of the municipal apparatus. The resource being looted was not cocaine or oil, but the very urban fabric of a city, its land, its zoning laws, its future. This form of corruption is especially insidious because its effects are permanent and visible to every citizen every day, a constant, concrete reminder of the state's betrayal. It creates a physical landscape of criminality. Furthermore, Ciancimino's story highlights the critical enabling role of broader political systems. Just as the Christian Democracy Party in Italy tolerated his activities for the sake of anti-communist electoral stability, other governments have often turned a blind eye to local corruption when it serves a larger geopolitical or economic goal. Whether it be the fight against communism, the rapid push for market liberalization, or simply the maintenance of a reliable political alliance. The international response to such captured states also follows a pattern seen in Italy: initial denial and complicity, followed by a catalytic event of shocking violence. The murders of Falcone and Borsellino, the assassination of a presidential candidate in Colombia, the bombings of apartment buildings in Russia, that finally galvanizes public opinion and forces a state crackdown. In this global panorama, Vito Ciancimino stands not as a unique monster, but as a classic archetype, the political fixer, the corrupt intermediary who builds the bridge between the underworld and the upper world. His specific tools were the building permit and the variante, but his function was the same as that of the bagman, the lobbyist, and the corrupt official everywhere. To translate criminal wealth into political power and political power back into legitimized criminal wealth. His life is a dark lesson in the universal vulnerability of democracies to this form of internal erosion, a warning that the greatest threat to a city's soul may not come from an invading army, but from a man in a suit sitting in a mayor's office, quietly signing away its future, one corrupt permit at a time. The journey to bring a figure as politically entrenched and legally shielded as Vito Ciancimino to justice was not merely a matter of gathering evidence. It was a protracted war of attrition against a deeply embedded system, a battle that forced the Italian legal system to evolve, innovate, and ultimately rewrite its own rule book to confront an enemy that was operating from within the very institutions designed to combat it. For decades, the Italian Penal Code was woefully inadequate to deal with the phenomenon of the Mafia. The law treated crimes as isolated acts, murder, extortion, kidnapping, and was ill-equipped to prosecute the concept of a criminal association, a continuing, structured organization whose power lay not just in individual acts of violence, but in its pervasive, silent control over territory and the economy. This legal framework played directly into the hands of men like Ciancimino. He could be investigated for a specific act of corruption, but proving a direct, explicit quid pro quo for a single building permit was difficult, and it entirely missed the larger, more sinister picture of his role as a permanent bridge between the Mafia and the state. The Cosa Nostra's power was metastructural, existing parallel to the state, and the old laws were designed to prosecute individuals, not shadow governments. The first major legal breakthrough was the introduction of Article 416 bis into the Italian Penal Code in 1982, following the murder of General Dalla Chiesa. This new law specifically defined the crime of Mafia-type association, making it illegal to belong to an organization that used intimidation, omerta, and subjugation to commit crimes and acquire control over economic activities, concessions, authorizations, and public contracts. This was a revolutionary tool. It allowed prosecutors like Giovanni Falcone to shift the focus from proving individual, isolated crimes to proving membership in the organization itself. For Ciancimino, this was a catastrophic legal development. The evidence against him was no longer just about a few corrupt permits. It was about his entire life's work, his relationships with mafia bosses, his unexplained wealth, his systematic use of his public office to benefit the Cosa Nostra's economic interests. The Maxi trial was the first great application of this new legal philosophy. And it was this law that formed the bedrock of the conviction of Ciancimino and hundreds of other mafiosi. However, The legal battle did not end with conviction. The Mafia's influence extended deep into the appeals process, and the first maxi trial verdicts were infamously overturned by the Supreme Court of Cassation in a ruling that sent shockwaves of despair through Italy, a decision that many believed was influenced by a still powerful Mafia lobby and political pressure. This demonstrated that having powerful laws was not enough. The entire judicial process, from investigation to final appeal, had to be fortified against manipulation and intimidation. This led to further innovations. The creation of a national anti-mafia prosecutor's office, DDA, to coordinate investigations across regional boundaries. The use of specialized, high-security courthouses to protect judges and juries, and refined procedures for handling the testimonies of pentiti. The legal pursuit of Ciancimino also highlighted the critical importance of financial forensics. Falcone was a pioneer in this, understanding that following the money was often more effective than following the bullets. Laws against money laundering and the seizure of assets suspected to be of illicit origin became powerful weapons. For a man like Ciancimino, whose power was fundamentally financial, the threat of having his meticulously accumulated wealth confiscated was a profound blow. His later, calculated cooperation with justice can be seen, in part, as a strategic response to these relentless legal and financial pressures. He was not just facing prison, he was facing the total dismantling of the financial empire he had built. The legal saga of Vito Ciancimino, therefore, is the story of a dynamic duel between a resilient criminal organism and a legal system struggling to adapt. His initial impunity was a product of an outdated legal code and a political climate that protected him. His eventual downfall was the result of a courageous and innovative generation of magistrates who weaponized the law, transforming it from a static set of rules into a dynamic, evolving organism capable of understanding and attacking the complex, corporate-like structure of the Cosa Nostra, the laws born from the fight against him and his kind, laws that target the association, the money, the assets, have become a model for other nations fighting similar criminal enterprises, a lasting legal legacy forged in the fiery crucible of Palermo's darkest years, a testament to the fact that to defeat a new kind of enemy, the law itself must be willing to learn, to change, and to fight back with every tool at its disposal. The grim saga of Vito Ciancimino and the sack of Palermo has transcended the confines of courtrooms and history books, seeping deeply into the cultural consciousness of Italy and beyond, becoming a powerful and enduring narrative explored through film, literature, television, and art, a process that has been essential in shaping public memory, processing collective trauma, and ensuring that the lessons of this dark chapter are not forgotten. In the immediate aftermath of the events, the primary cultural response was one of journalism and non-fiction, with books like The Death of a City by Matteo Callura and excellent takeovers by Alexander Still serving as essential chronicles that piece together a complex web of corruption for a public seal reeling from the murders of Falcone and Borsellino. These works were acts of civic duty, providing the detailed, evidence-based account that the fragmented and often terrifying news reports of the time could not. They established the fundamental narrative of the sack of Palermo and Ciancimino's central role within it, framing him not as a folk hero or a romantic rogue, but as the cold, calculating engineer of a system that had betrayed its people. As time created a necessary distance, the story began to be processed through the more interpretive lenses of cinema and drama. Fictionalized and stylized representations allowed audiences to engage with the emotional and human truths of the story in a way that pure reportage could not. While no major film has placed Ciancimino squarely as the protagonist, he looms as a spectral, off-screen presence in many works about the period, the unnamed but well-understood power in the town hall, the acclaimed television series The Octopus, La Piovra, which ran for over a decade, captured the public imagination with its epic portrayal of the fight between an honest cop and the tentacled, all-reaching Mafia. And while it did not name Ciancimino, the show's depiction of corrupt politicians and the concrete cancer consuming Sicily was directly inspired by his reign. More recent productions have been more direct. The film, The 100 Steps, Dai Cento Passi, tells the heartbreaking story of Giuseppe Impastato, and in doing so, it vividly portrays the cultural and political climate of Palermo in the 1970s, a world where a figure like Ciancimino was an unassailable pillar of the establishment. His power so normalized that mocking him on a radio show was seen as an act of revolutionary and ultimately fatal courage. The excellent television series The Mafia Kills Only in Summer uses a unique blend of satire, romance, and tragedy to tell the story of a boy growing up in a Palermo terrorized by mafia bombs. And the show's depiction of the corrupt, cynical political class is a clear echo of Ciancimino's legacy. These cultural products serve a crucial function. They translate complex historical and judicial facts into human stories. They make the abstract concept of political corruption tangible by showing its effects on families, on love, on childhood, and on the simple desire to live a normal life. They have been instrumental in the process of national mourning and reckoning, providing a space for collective grief and anger. Furthermore, they have played a vital role in the education of younger generations who did not live through the terror of the 1980s and 1990s, ensuring that the memory of what happened is passed down not as a dry historical footnote, but as a compelling and emotionally resonant cautionary tale. Beyond narrative fiction, the physical landscape of Palermo itself has become a permanent, open-air museum of this period. The surviving villas, now often derelict and fenced off, stand as ghostly reminders of what was lost, while the oppressive, gray apartment blocks of the periphery are the ongoing, daily evidence of the sack. Street art and memorial plaques, particularly those dedicated to Falcone, Borsellino, and Impastato, have transformed the city's walls into a landscape of memory, a constant, public rebuttal to the culture of silence. The work of artists and photographers who have documented the city's transformation has also been vital, creating a visual archive of the destruction that is both aesthetically powerful and historically essential. The cultural representation of Vito Ciancimino's world, therefore, is not a secondary aspect of his story. It is a fundamental part of its conclusion. It is through these films, books, and artworks that the city and the nation have begun to process, understand, and ultimately to resist the legacy he left behind. They have taken the narrative of corruption away from the corrupt and given it back to the people, transforming a story of defeat into a tool for vigilance, a permanent cultural immune response against the disease that once nearly consumed the city, ensuring that the name Vito Ciancimino will be remembered not with power or respect, but as a byword for betrayal, a permanent stain on the pages of history and in the collective soul of a people who refused, in the end, to be silenced. The legacy of Vito Ciancimino and the sack of Palermo did not vanish with his death. It remained etched in the city's concrete and in the psyche of its people, presenting a monumental challenge of urban and social recovery that would require decades of struggle, a reawakening of civic conscience, and a determined effort to reclaim the city's soul from the ruins left by the Mafia's reign. The process of healing began not with grand governmental decrees from Rome, but from the ground up, spearheaded by a new generation of Palermitans who, inspired by the sacrifices of Falcone, Borsellino, and Impastato, refused to accept the Mafia's dominion as a permanent state of affairs. This grassroots movement found powerful symbols in the reclamation of public space. The most poignant example is the transformation of the city's historic center, which had been largely abandoned to decay and Mafia control during the building frenzy on the outskirts. A pivotal figure in this renaissance was Leoluca Orlando, who served as mayor from 1993 to 2000 and again from 2012 to 2022. Orlando's administration made the revitalization of the Centro Storico a central pillar of its anti-mafia strategy, understanding that restoring beauty, life, and legality to the heart of the city was a direct rebuke to the values of the sack. Through European Union funding and a clear political will, crumbling palaces were restored, piazzas were pedestrianized, and schools and cultural centers were opened in areas once dominated by crime. This was more than an urban renewal project. It was a form of civic therapy, a physical demonstration that the state could return and provide for its citizens. Simultaneously, a powerful social movement against the pizzo, the Mafia's protection racket, began to take hold. In 2004, a small group of brave business owners, led by the young entrepreneur Libero Grassi, who had been murdered for his defiance years earlier, founded Addio Pizzo, a declaration that they would no longer pay the extortion money and would publicly denounce those who demanded it. This movement grew from a handful of shops to a network of hundreds of businesses and thousands of consumers who pledged to support pizzo, free establishments. Addio Pizzo was a revolutionary act because it attacked the Mafia's economic base, not with laws and police, but with social and market forces, creating a parallel economy of legality and courage. It gave business owners a collective voice and protection, reducing the isolation and fear that the Mafia had thrived upon for so long. In schools, a new educational curriculum began to emerge, teaching a culture of legality to children, explaining the history of the Mafia and the importance of civic duty, actively working to dismantle the culture of omerta that had been passed down through generations. This long, arduous process of recovery has been uneven and remains incomplete. The vast, anonymous suburbs born from the sack of Palermo continue to be pockets of deep social disadvantage and Mafia influence, where unemployment is high and state services are stretched thin. The psychological scars on the population, the deep-seated distrust in institutions cannot be erased in a single generation. Corruption has not been eliminated. It has become more sophisticated, adapting to new opportunities in public contracting and waste management. Yet, the change is undeniable and profound. Palermo today is a city transformed, not back to what it was before Ciancimino, but into something new, a city that openly confronts its past. The Uscierdone prison, where the Maxi trial was held, now offers tours that explain its history. The homes of Falcone and Borsellino have become places of pilgrimage. The city's vibrant cultural life, its thriving street food scene, and its status as a tourist destination are all testaments to its resilience. The recovery of Palermo is a powerful testament to the idea that a city is not just its buildings, but the spirit of its people. It is a story of a long, slow awakening from a nightmare, a daily choice to reject fear and complicity in favor of beauty, community, and the rule of law. The shadow of Vito Ciancimino still falls across the city, but it is no longer a shadow that paralyzes. It is a shadow that serves as a warning, a dark contrast against which the hard, one light of Palermo's rebirth shines all the more brightly. A permanent reminder that even the most deeply entrenched systems of corruption can be challenged when citizens find the courage to reclaim their city, their dignity, and their future. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through the long, dark shadow cast by Vito Ciancimino, a journey that began in the dusty aspirations of a small Sicilian town and culminated in the systematic betrayal of an entire city, a narrative that stretches across the 20th century as a stark lesson in the corrosive power of unchecked ambition and the terrifying ease with which the lines between government and criminality can be erased. The story of the former mayor of Palermo is not merely a chronicle of one man's corruption. It is the anatomy of a system, a detailed blueprint of how a democratic institution can be hollowed out from within, its powers perverted into instruments of private enrichment and criminal consolidation. We have witnessed his rise from a local fixer to the ultimate insider, the political mastermind who weaponized urban planning, transforming building permits and zoning laws into the primary tools for the Cosa Nostra's conquest of Palermo. We have traced the intricate web of his alliances with the most ruthless mafia bosses of the modern era, men like Riina and Bernardo Provenzano, whose reign of terror was bankrolled by the billions of lire extracted from the sack of Palermo, the concrete cancer that devoured the city's historic villas and gardens, replacing them with a soulless, oppressive landscape that stands as a permanent monument to his crime. We have followed the courageous, often fatal, resistance of those who stood against him. The mocking voice of Giuseppe Impastato, silenced by a bomb. The meticulous legal minds of Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, assassinated in a desperate attempt to halt their pursuit of justice. We have seen the Italian state slowly, painfully awaken to the threat within, forging new legal weapons like the law against Mafia association and waging the historic battle of the Maxi trial, a conflict in which Ciancimino was both a key defendant and, later, a cryptic, self-serving source of secrets. We have explored the global echoes of his story, recognizing that the fusion of political office and organized crime is a universal vulnerability, a warning to democracies everywhere. And we have seen, finally, the long and difficult road to recovery, the grassroots movements, the cultural reckonings, and the slow, steadfast work of citizens and leaders to reclaim their city's soul from the ruins he helped create. The life of Vito Ciancimino forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of power, the fragility of public trust, and the seductive allure of corruption when it is dressed in the respectable garb of political authority. He was not a monster who fell from the sky. He was a product of a specific environment, a man who mastered a flawed system and exploited it to its logical, terrifying conclusion. His legacy is a double one. He is both a symbol of the deepest betrayal and, in his ultimate downfall and the resilience that followed, a testament to the fact that such systems can be broken. The story of Palermo's suffering and its slow rebirth is a powerful message that darkness, no matter how deep, does not have to be permanent. And this is where this story leaves its most important responsibility, not on the pages of history, but with you, the viewer. The tale of Vito Ciancimino is not a closed chapter, a dark fairy tale from a distant land. It is a living lesson in vigilance. The mechanisms he used may seem grandiose, but the principles are alarmingly simple. The quiet deal, the overlooked conflict of interest, the politician who serves a private interest over the public good, the cynical acceptance that this is just how things are done. These are the seeds from which empires of corruption grow. Therefore, this narrative must end not with a period, but with a call to action, a plea for engagement and awareness that transcends the specific case of Palermo. I urge you to carry this story with you. Be the vigilant citizen in your own community. Question power. Demand transparency from your leaders. Support the journalists and the whistleblowers who work to uncover the truth. For they are the modern-day counterparts to those who spoke out in Sicily at great personal risk. Reject the cynical notion that corruption is inevitable. The fight against the fusion of crime and political power is not confined to courtrooms in Italy. It is a daily struggle that requires an informed, active, and courageous citizenry everywhere. The memory of those who died for this principle in Sicily demands nothing less. So, as this channel is dedicated to bringing you these meticulously researched stories from the darker corners of history, your role is crucial. Subscribe to stay informed with our deep dives into the events that have shaped our world. share this video to spread this vital lesson in civic awareness. Let us know in the comments your thoughts on this complex and chilling story. How do you see these themes playing out in the world today? Your engagement turns history from a passive lesson into an active tool for a more just future. The story of Vito Ciancimino is a warning etched in concrete and blood. Let us honor the memory of his victims, not with passive remembrance, but with a renewed commitment to ensuring that such a betrayal never happens again, anywhere. Thank you for listening.